I'm making a retro-style survival horror game based on classics like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, called The Revanchist. And I'm running a bit of a behind-the-scenes series on it right now, where we're gonna take a little bit more of a detailed look and give you guys a peek behind the curtain on how this game is really being made. And today we're doing a bit of a mini episode. I want to talk a bit about making levels, not necessarily level design, that's a very complicated topic, and since this is a Resident Evil style survival horror game, all of my levels are pretty simple in terms of gameplay requirements. Instead, I want to talk about the actual mechanical process of making these levels. So without further ado, let's get into it. Why don't we start off with planning? Or rather, the lack thereof. Because level design is very complicated. There's a lot of things to consider and tons of moving parts to account for. So you really do have to plan them out and ask questions like, what kind of gameplay do I want here? How are things gonna flow? How are the enemies programming gonna handle this? And is it gonna be interesting to explore, etc, etc. And the way I approach planning for levels in the Revanchist is actually quite simple. It's actually the same way I plan out everything in the Revanchist. I don't. I come up with a really rough idea for what I want to make, and then I make it. Because I've got memory issues, and it's tough for me to keep on one train of thought long enough to actually visualize something and start planning it. So for things like level design, I can't even usually keep track of what I want long enough to actually start putting pen to paper and making a real plan at all. All I can really do is drop down a doorway as a starting point and a scale reference, and then just go with the flow. But then as far as my actual workflow for making the levels is concerned, it's gone through a few different iterations. I started off by just modeling environments in 3ds Max, but that was a massive pain in the ass. Just getting a feel for the space and proportions was a huge headache because every time I wanted to tweak something, I had to open up the modeling software, make any adjustments, export it, then re-import it into Unreal. Not too long after I started, I grabbed the Blockout Tools plugin. This let me throw levels together much faster and easier, but I was limited to very simple boxy shapes. After blocking out the level, I would then export it and model it in 3ds Max to give it a little bit more detail. This made prototyping a little bit easier, but still had a lot of the same problems as far as being a huge pain in the ass. Eventually, I just started using materials with world-aligned textures, and then just threw that on the blockout boxes so I can use them as the actual final geometry and still make tweaks or adjustments in Engine when I need to. Problem is, the levels all felt really boxy, simple, and bland. Well, a little while ago, I was actually contacted by the developer of an add-on called Scythe looking for feedback, and I'm just now realizing I never got back to him with any real feedback. I'm gonna have to do that right away. Either way, it's currently in beta and only generally accessible to patrons. But he sent me access to a free copy, and I've gotta say, this is by far the best add-on that I've gotten for this game so far. It's just a simple but pretty robust level editor built directly into Unreal, and it's absolutely revolutionized my level production workflow. Not sponsored or anything obviously, but if you see the workflow in this video and you like it, I'm gonna leave a link to Scythe in the description for you. But from there, there's also a specific way I make my environment textures, since my game's going for kind of a hybrid, photorealistic PSX blend. So what I've decided to do is use Megascans. Problem is, Megascans were intended for realistic, physically based rendering, and while my game does technically use that, it doesn't really, not as intended at least. Basically all this means is I can't just use the normal diffuse map as the base color because it looks completely flat, and that won't work when that's your only texture map. But in this case, making the final textures is actually a really simple process. First, I just multiply the ambient occlusion on top of the diffuse map to darken the shadows and cavities a bit. Next, I'll grab the red and green channels respectively out of the normal map and set them to overlay for some cheap faked lighting. Depending on the texture, there may be some additional tweaks or color balancing to get it right, but this is really generally all it takes. Then I crunch it down small and dither the color palette. All in all, this just lets me get very nice looking retro style textures with lighting and shadowing baked in very quickly and very easily, so I can give the game a lot of variety. And the best part is, I get to use assets without them even really looking like assets anymore. And that even goes for 3D assets as well, though that is a much more involved process to create. So now that we've gone over the basics, let's start jumping into some actual levels. So why don't we start with what I'm just going to call the holding cells. This is the best non-spoiler name I could think of right now for these. Either way, for this, I wanted a bit of a larger, slightly more open space. So far, more or less the entire game has taken place underground, and has been pretty claustrophobic except for just a few spots. I want to make sure I throw in a wider open space every now and then just to break things up a little. So here the plan was a large open room with maybe some columns or pillars or something in the middle just to break it up, and then rows of doors down to the sides. I wanted a space where I could make a unique and interesting combat encounter, something that's a bit more of a fight rather than just bumping into zombies in a hallway and such. So with that, I needed to give enough room to maneuver, but not so much that you could freely avoid enemies. I also want to have rows of doors down each side of the room leading to padded cells. So in Unreal Engine, I started out by laying down the structure of the room itself and added pillars to the middle as well as the doors down the sides. And as I was setting up the pillars in this room, I had an idea to make an arched ceiling on either side of that row of pillars just to break things up and make it feel a bit more interesting. Now instead of one room with some pillars in the middle, it almost feels like two adjacent hallways. And as far as materials are concerned, this level in particular was a bit of a tough one to figure out. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to do a smoothed out, cast concrete or industrial look, or more of a stone brick and cobblestone dungeon kind of look. So I screwed around and played with things a lot. Eventually I ended up settling on kind of a 50-50 middle ground. And those columns at the middle were definitely a sticking point for me. I could not find a material I liked on them, and spent probably like 10 or 15 minutes straight just trying different options before I finally settled on one I like. When I'm building levels, it's also important for me to test it out as I go. Again, planning is very minimal, so testing in the moment is generally the only way to really see if it's going to work out or not in gameplay. So I'll look for a couple of things. First of all, how does it feel to play and walk around? Is it too big, too small, too open, too cramped? Things like that. It's also important to think about how would combat work and a few other considerations as well to make sure that this is fun to play through. The other thing I test is lighting and atmosphere. I've said it before, I'll say it again, lighting is one of the most important parts of making a good looking final image. And as I've mentioned before, I like to kind of set up shots in this game almost like the way a cinematographer might in a movie. So over and over again while testing a level, I'll walk through it, I'll walk around each corner, down each hallway from all directions, and test out the lighting and fog and other such effects to see if the level has the atmosphere that I'm going for, and I'll make some tweaks accordingly. And I definitely tweak the lighting constantly while I'm working on levels. And finally, when I was working on this level, I had no idea what I was going to put at this end of the room over here. Eventually, I decided to just kind of do a security observation room at the end. It'd be a good chance to do some environmental storytelling, and I've got a couple of gameplay ideas for it as well. As usual, I had no plan for this room. I just thought, let's add a room at the end, and I winged it. Took a bit of tweaking before I got the size and layout quite right, but that's how things tend to go. Now at this point, I was really starting to love Scythe. I'm still using a really early version, I haven't even installed the updates he sent me for it, but it's still been a huge improvement over my previous workflow. It's not like a level like this would have been impossible, it really wouldn't have been, but with my previous workflow, it would have taken twice as long and been 3 times the headache. And even though this is still my first time using it, and as usual, I didn't actually do anything to try to learn it, I just went in and started fucking around, I was able to make this whole level and this whole level in a single sitting, which I would say is not too bad. Finally, let's talk sewer level. It's not a sewer, I'm officially changing the name to Waterworks, but I'll be real, in essence, it's a sewer level. A lot of people don't like these, and I get it. Personally, I'm of the opinion that they can be done right. Problem is, they're usually bland and monotonous and just tend to suck. They're not even a real level or environment most of the time, they're just padding, and I'm making sure that I don't do that here. And this is the only one where I really recorded the entire creation process, so let's get into a little bit more detail with it. So starting with the concept, you're going to be entering this area by climbing down a ladder, and I want this to be a smaller room with an opening in the ceiling for the ladder to come through that opens up into the sewers. For the sewers themselves, I'm not super sure. I know I want some kind of archway ceiling, and I want to have a walkway on either side with a fairly deep canal down the middle. I want the sewer to be a fairly long, straight hallway with a couple of branches and hard corners. And while each of the walkways is going to be restricted and fairly narrow, the space itself is going to be one of the largest and most wide open that you've been in so far. So with that all in mind, let's start working. Starting with the room you came in, it's nothing fancy. I just wanted a small square room with a hole in the ceiling. From there, I extruded it out and started working on the main canal area. I started off by playing around and figuring out what shape I wanted the curved ceiling to be. I gave it a few iterations and a couple of different tries before I settled on a profile that I liked. It also took some trial and error getting the scale and size right, since the main waterway started off way too small and the space wasn't nearly as imposing as I would have liked. But once I had a kind of a vertical slice cross-section that I liked, I expanded on the length. Once I got a basic layout figured out, now it was time to add some water. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do for a water material, but I put this one together for now. By the way, I went through a bunch of different iterations in the water material as I went, so if you notice it looks different from one shot to another, just don't even question it, okay? Thanks. And again, because the game has kind of a hybrid visual style where it's simultaneously photorealistic and janky PS1 graphics, much like for the foliage in the forest, finding the right style of water material is just going to be a continuous trial and error process. But after that, it was time to get the materials set up. In this case, I knew I wanted to do a kind of rough, grimy, stone brick look to everything, so it was actually a pretty quick and simple process. And this is also the first time in the game so far that I've made a new light fixture aside from the base overhead fluorescent lights that I've used for everything else so far. Unfortunately, I wasn't forward thinking enough to make the blueprint modular, so I had to refactor a couple of things to be compatible with different light types, such as a point light instead of rect lights. That being said, once I got those placed, the lighting still felt very flat and bland, so I added some cooler toned overhead lighting as well as some subtle lighting under the water to add a little bit of fake extra light bounce. When the lighting was how I want it, I did a little bit of detailing, still keeping that minimal at this stage, but just enough to help me get a feel for the space. I added in some gates to block off the ends of the walkways, as well as some overhead pipes and supports. But even with these, things still felt a bit too flat and a bit too clean, so I decided to make a new master material. This one generating some automated grime, because my meshes are way too low res for polypaint to work, so I figured this would be a good backup plan, but it does add some shader complexity, so I've got to be cautious about when I use it. Basically, the material will try to estimate cavities and layer on a grime texture to help break things up a little bit. It definitely does have a little bit of problems, but so does everything in this game, frankly. I think it's good enough effect to do its job, but it did take a very long time to dial in. Regardless, I'm happy with the final result. Things did still feel a bit too nice and clean though, so I give it one more pass through, this time with decals, and I also added some dripping water particle systems to make this whole place feel damp and grimy. And here we have the result of a day's work. I'm glad that I'm finally getting comfortable with Scythe as a level editor, and it's getting easier and easier for me to make this kind of thing. While it's definitely not my favorite spot in the game aesthetically, I'm very happy with how this level turned out. Particularly things like the water and the grime material had me a bit nervous because I wasn't quite sure what I would do or if they were even going to work, but I managed to pull them off. Moving forward, I would like to start planning out my levels a little bit more, particularly in terms of layout. Planning out entire areas especially is going to be a big benefit for me in terms of planning puzzles and exploration. Because as fun as it is to just jump in and start making levels off the top of my head, that is not necessarily great game design. So I'm trying to keep this one quick and simple. This was actually just a segment out of my previous video where we took a broader look at the inner workings of the Revanchist, but I had enough to talk about that I figured I'd promote it to its own smaller video. And if you like what you see, you have to give me a wishlist. Sorry, I don't make the rules, that's just how it is. Also, check out the rest of this behind the scenes series where I talk about all sorts of different things regarding this game. I'd also love to hear what you think, if you got any specific points on how I can improve this workflow especially. So as always, thank you very much, and have a fantastic rest of your day.